Morning, nice to see you all. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I've dedicated the last couple of years thinking about. I don't think anyone by the company they work in gets a perspective on culture, but I was particularly interested as someone who worked at Twitter, previously worked at Google, and I was interested when you search for best companies to work or best cultures, I was interested that Google always came to the top. And that hadn't always been my experience working there. And I found myself a couple of years ago at an environment where the culture where people in my own company, people had told me that it'd been an incredible culture in the London office. I noticed that that had gone. And I found myself consumed with trying to study how culture improved and the way to improve culture. And so, consequently, I started doing a podcast. That's it there on the left-hand side, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. What I found, this is a big audience today, what I found is no matter how hard I pitch that podcast to audiences like this, no one listens to it. So I'm going to work on the basis that I'm not even going to mention that podcast now. Consider that the homework I did while you weren't paying attention. You're never going to listen, so I'm going to try and summarise for you what I learned by talking to the leading psychologists and organisational behaviouralists in the world. Let's pretend that podcast doesn't exist. However, the book on the right-hand side is going to be the first book you ever pre-order. And the reason why, I don't know if you've ever bought anything, and normally it involves wine, and you buy it off eBay, and just as you press buy, and then you realise it says dispatched from China. And so you realise, oh, right, okay, it's going to be 6 weeks before I get that. And then 6 weeks later, a gift arrives in the post, and it's like a magical fairy has gifted you an item because you forgot about buying it. That's what you might get, the benefit you might get of pre-ordering that. I'm not going to pitch that anymore. Right, good. Right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to try and give you a perspective of how the world of work's changing and how we can build culture that will be fit for innovation. There's broadly, before I go into some of the stuff, there's broadly two mega trends going on in the midst of the world of work. The first one was we all accepted emails onto our mobile phones 15 years ago. There's people in the room who don't even remember that day. Let me describe the scene for you. Here's what happened, is that people were going about a casual, quite calm Tuesday, and then a rumour went round that John had a BlackBerry. And people went sniffing around John's desk. All right, John, how come you got that? He said, I need to stay in touch with the figures when I'm out of the office. Then all of a sudden, everyone found themselves going to the IT officer, asking if they could get a BlackBerry to stay in touch. That single act increased the amount we all work by 2 hours per day. So it all increased the average working day from 7.5 hours a day to 9.5 hours a day. So as you're sitting there tonight, watching I'm a Celebrity, swiping away emails, remember that moment. We should have battled against that moment. The other mega trend is that none of us believe it, but in the same way that tsunami of email arrived, we're going to see a degree of automation in the next few years. And none of us believe it. My friend's a lawyer. The legal profession is one of the first professions that's going to be decimated by machine learning because a lot of law is pattern recognition. You see a legal case, it's like that other legal case. Okay, right, match that one up, done. And so none of us believe it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. And I often, I've shown this before, but I always think of this, the feeling when you realise the robots will steal your job. Right, here's what I'm going to talk to you about. This broadly, when you're looking at incredible, innovative, creative working cultures, there are two themes that you need to establish. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. First one is positive effect. The second one is psychological safety. Now, you might have heard some of these terms, but if you haven't, let me illustrate what they are with the aid of two phone calls. The first one is, imagine this. You're sitting at home and you're back to I'm a Celeb. You're sitting there on the sofa and the phone rings. And at the end of the line is someone, and they've dialed the wrong number. They've called you, and they meant to phone their brother who was going to be picking them up. That wouldn't be a problem other than the fact they're calling from a payphone, and they've just used their last coin. Now, what you do next is strongly influenced by whether you're in positive effect or not. A way that we might sort of call it is good mood. What the pioneering psychologist who discovered this found, a woman called Alice Ison, she said that if we're in a good mood, our reaction is completely different to if we're not. If we're in a good mood, we tend to say, look, why don't I take the number, I'll pass on a message. Even though we're in the middle of something else, we sort of reach out to people, we extend ourselves to people. When we're in a bad mood, we don't do that. That's particularly of interest because Alice Ison also went then, and she went into hospitals. She gave doctors a gift to put them in a state of positive effect. And what she noticed was doctors who were in a state of positive effect were far more thorough when it came to reading patients' notes. They asked more questions, they interrogated far more, they did a better job. So next time you go into the hospital, make sure you take a box of chocolates. But she observed that actually we collaborate more, we do a more complete job. So that's positive effect. I'm going to go on and illustrate how we can bring that into our working environments and the impact it will have. The other one is psychological safety. And another phone call. So imagine this time you're a nurse in a hospital and you notice when you're reading through a patient's notes that a patient's been given triple the dose they were meant to get of a really potentially harmful medicine they're receiving. What you do next depends on the state of psychological safety of your organisation. So psychological safety is the willingness of people to speak up to bosses, the willingness to challenge what you see, even if you're a low status person. Normally what you find, the woman who did this work was a woman called Amy Edmondson, and she went into a series of hospitals across the US, and she observed where nurses were willing to speak up to doctors. What she found was there was a really interesting situation. So she observed the performance of different teams, the quality of different teams, and when she'd seen that she'd identified the best quality teams, she then looked at their errors, the amount of errors they made. The best team that she identified, then when she looked at the errors, had made 10 times the errors of the worst team. And she couldn't understand it. She couldn't understand how this really qualified team that seemed to have a strong sense of collaboration were making 10 times the errors. And she found it wasn't that they were making 10 times the errors. They were 10 times more likely to mention them. They were 10 times more likely to say to each other, there's been a mistake made here. And that's what psychological safety is, that willingness to speak up without fear of being judged. Now, if you're going to create positive working cultures, you need to try and create those two environments. And that's the secret. If you look at the most innovative companies in the world, companies like Pixar have built psychological safety into something they run called the Brains Trust. So people can sit in a circle, they give very direct feedback to each other, but it's built into their system, it's built into the way they work. So what I'm going to try and do is show you how you can take advantage of these things and really how innovation and creativity comes from a very different place than we might think. I'm going to sort of break it down into two things. So if you're looking for the way to innovate a culture, you need to try and systematize thinking, you need to try and discover new ways of thinking, and then you need to build sync between individuals in the team. Sync leads to that psychological safety, and thinking actually is the sort of thing that's being squeezed out. The reason why thinking is especially important is that if you look at the burden that the average worker's got, right now, it's higher than ever before. So the average, according to the Harvard Business Review, the average manager has 23 hours of meetings a week. In the UK, I think Management Today did a survey, and they said that the average British office worker has 16 hours of meetings a week. And if you explore the root cause of thinking and creativity tends to come not in busyness, but in the gaps between things. So there's an interesting stat that someone looked at the power of walking. They looked at a woman called Mary Apresso at Stanford University, looked at the power of walking. And what she found was that even though we think that thinking takes place in the confines of a desk or we're sitting at our desk, she actually found that when you send people out for a walk, their ideas, 81% of people who go for a walk, their ideas increase, and their ideas increase by 2/3. So it's just a massively stimulating place to change our mindset, to get into a different state. Another example of that is there's a part of our brain that's triggered in these situations. And another example of that is the guy who wrote The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin. He wrote The West Wing, he wrote The Social Network, and he's stumbled upon something that's very similar. He says that his best ideas happen when he's in the shower. And so as a result of that, he had a shower installed in his office, and just in the corner of his office, and he takes eight showers a day. And he was asked about it. He was asked by a Hollywood Reporter, a US publication. He was asked about it, and he said, I'm not OCD, I'm not obsessive, but what I find is my best ideas happen when I'm in the shower. So as a result, I just go in there and I absorb that moment. And that's something, the brain has multiple systems and they sort of overlap. Normally, if you look at neuroscientists, systems are very sort of imprecise ways to try and describe things that happen. But this is part of the brain called the default network. And the default network, like going for a walk or like just being distracted really, it's sort of, the default network is a bit like our capacity to daydream. And it's triggered by going into the shower. I chatted to the marketing guru, Seth Godin, a couple of weeks ago. And he told me that his big breakthrough in his life was when he'd learned of the name of what to call his sort of big innovation, permission marketing. He said until then, it used to take him 1.5 years to sell this email marketing to people. And so he said, I'm going to get in the shower, and until I've got a better name for this, I'm not going to get out. That's it, because the way we think is often very different to the reality of the way we think is very different to the way we believe we think. So, triggering the default network is incredibly powerful. But the reason why we work in companies and the reason why we work in offices is not to work alone, is to try and harness the benefit of working together. And so I just want to sort of illustrate now the way, if you're going to reach that state of psychological safety, then you need to think about how you can build the sync between teams. So let me illustrate what I mean. Well, firstly, there's been loads of work on the impact of being alongside other people and the impact that has. So while we might think that our work is individual, or we might think that our work is not reliant on others, there's actually countless examples of when people are doing things adjacent to each other, they tend to work more. So there was a Harvard professor, Floyd Allport, who put people working alongside each other. And just the very fact of people working next to each other, their work rate increased by about 20%. But it's also been observed in rowers. So a big study looked at putting rowers separate from each other and together. Now, all of us might recognize this. If you've ever done exercise with someone else, you know that naturally you do try harder. And the way that this is observed is that when rowers row alongside each other, their capacity to endure pain, their capacity to just put up with things, to get on with things, to work harder, measurably goes up. It goes up really significantly. But you also see this in other instances too. So this is a lot of research about choirs. And choirs have a really interesting impact because in themselves, people who participate in choirs demonstrate a higher increase in positive effect, but they also demonstrate the same willingness to increase our pain threshold. Psychologists have got this thing about inflicting pain upon people. I don't know why, but I think they try and use it as a measure of how people are willing to go over and above. But what you observe is when you put people in choirs together, the very fact, even if they don't know those people, you send strangers along and you get them to sing, it doesn't have to be religious songs, it can be pop songs, but you put them alongside each other and their capacity to endure pain and to work alongside each other goes up massively. So if you're going to try and build psychological safety in your team, trying to find a way to build sync amongst people is really powerful. And I'll give you another example of why sync is so important. So there was a big piece of research that studied couples that had long-distance relationships, but survived. So these were unmarried couples, and they studied 5,000 unmarried couples across the US. And they wanted to understand when couples stayed together. And there's really interesting lessons from it. The couples that stayed together were the ones that made time for a daily phone call about trivial things. Why? Because when we're in sync with other people, we feel connected to them. And so the couples who didn't make time for that, and you can understand, it might seem too trivial to talk about the guy who's come around to clean the windows, but it was the couples who did that stayed together when separated by time. The capacity to sync and the capacity to link with other people is a really important part. So then you have to start thinking, what are the ways to build that in an organisation? I chatted to a guy called Ben Wabber, who runs a sort of human resources data company. And what they do is they create these badges that you put around your neck. Really interesting technology that came from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Put these badges around your neck, and what they do is they measure all the interactions that take place in an office. He said from his work that he was able to see, firstly, emails accounted for about 2% of office productivity, meetings accounted for about 2%, but face-to-face chat accounted for about 38 to 40%. So face-to-face chat is one of the most powerful things. And he said, therefore, by extrapolation, one of the best things that any organisation can do is think about the location of the kettle or think about the location of the water machine. Because what you tend to find is that where you place those things has a direct impact on how the office communicates with each other. In fact, he gave me an example of this. So this is an example from a call centre. And he wanted to understand how the placing of breaks, the placing of interventions could have an impact on how an office collaborated. So these were call centre workers, and they were already having a 15-minute break together. He said, they're already having a 15-minute break, but separately. He said, how about if we put them all on a 15-minute break together? So they're call centre workers, their whole time when they're working is consumed with answering phone calls. But he said, if we put them on a 15-minute break, I want to see if the power of chat has any impact on how they work. Here's the stats he got. So the first thing you notice, 15 minutes, it was a free intervention. Anyone could do this, it cost them nothing. Next thing they noticed was stress levels went down by 19%. When we're in sync with other people, a bit like those people in the choir withstanding pain, a bit like the people who are rowing withstanding more pain, when we're in sync with each other, our stress levels go down and our capacity to do stuff improves. But here's what they hadn't expected, the performance levels of those teams, so their ability to resolve customers' calls to satisfaction, their performance levels went up by 23%. So being in sync with other people increased their performance levels by almost a quarter. Now, look, I think any business would readily take that, that would be next year's target sorted. The being in sync had it, and he was really sort of fascinated why it had backed up what he said. And he said they looked into it, and it had been people who had been sitting in the call centre, they'd just taken a difficult call, stressful. The very fact that it was stressful, they went and talked to other people. It reduced that stress. But those people together, by being in sync, it helped them solve each other's problems. People were able to say to each other, okay, I've just had this really difficult call. Another person would say, yeah, when that happens to me, here's what I do. And that, therefore, meant that next time they took a difficult call like that, they were able to resolve it. Being in sync not only increased the resilience of the team, but it also increased their problem solving. So what I've observed is that actually teams who prioritise building sync amongst people have a massive impact. And there's a really strange thing. I've observed that companies that have a social meeting, almost like an embarrassingly trivial meeting on the calendar that doesn't really serve massive purpose, they seem to outperform companies that don't have that. One person called it in her company, she called it Crisp Thursday. And she said it was the PA had invented it and had invited everyone to 4:30 on a Thursday, had invited everyone to gather around, they have a long table that runs down their office, and they'd laid on crisps. Really trivial, and almost too embarrassing to mention. When a new CEO started, he said, what's this? You know, like when you go around someone's Christmas house and you observe their weird family quirks. The CEO was like, I think we're going to get rid of this. And he was sort of keen to remove it. And she said, but the strange thing is, it had this invisible magic, this invisible sync connecting people together. And you see it a lot. There's a sort of business guru, sort of 5-time CEO, Margaret Heffernan. And Margaret Heffernan had run 2 or 3 businesses in the UK, then went over, because her husband moved to Boston, she went over to run a business in the US. And she introduced a social meeting, largely because she said there was no connection between people working here. She described it as completely transformational. It transformed the way that people worked with each other. She said before that, everyone was very tasky. Everyone was sort of treating each other without any sort of human connection. By introducing a social meeting, she saw a massive increase in the amount of sync and the connection between people. So I've not had long. The critical thing, I think, when you're thinking about building strong team cultures, is thinking about driving positive effect and building psychological safety. It's worth saying how hard it is to achieve these things. You know, a lot of people think the way to build positive effect is to give smoothies to people. And what you tend to find is that even though that might work once, witness giving the gift to the doctors in the hospital. It doesn't work repeatedly. So the challenge is, how can you keep people in a state of positive effect? You generally have to do it by making their work lives easier, by reducing some of the demands upon them. But psychological safety is the hardest thing of all to achieve. It's why in airlines, most airline crashes don't happen because of mechanical failure. The vast majority of airline crashes happen because of pilot error. And so what the aviation industry has had to do is, because there's so little psychological safety, people are scared to speak up to pilots. They've had to mandate it. They introduced something called crew resource management, so to mandate psychological safety. So to get it in any business is incredibly hard, and you need to work hard. To get people to speak up to the boss is an incredibly difficult thing. So, but you know, when you do achieve those things, that's where greatness lies. So thank you very much. Thanks for giving me the chance to start the day. There you go, pre-orders available on Amazon. Thank you. Just stay again.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We are quite tight, as you've seen. The agenda is quite packed. But if you do have any questions, obviously